Folks, this is Tom Opre, your host to the podcast where we ask the tough questions regarding man's impact on the world's wildlife. Raw and unfiltered, we strive to help you fully understand the real issues at hand. Our goal, ensuring the world's wildlife and wildlife habitat exists forever. Stay tuned for another edition of Shepherds of the Wild.
So Pete, tell me a little bit about your responsibility at American Prairie. Maybe just kind of tell me kind of how you got into it, because you're one of the longtime employees that have been there. So try to give me a little bit of background on why you're there and how you got there.
Sure. So I'm gonna start way back. I grew up in New York State, and from a very early age, fell in love with the West, and like a lot of people, came to Montana with our family to visit Yellowstone, and then ended up working at the National Outdoor Leadership School in Wyoming and really developed a passion for public lands. I came to American Prairie in 2011 after spending 15 years doing environmental economics here in Bozeman and trying to think about how we can get markets to provide environmental quality like fresh fruit in February. And one of the things that I worked on was large landscapes. How can we get a Bob Marshall-sized wilderness without having to go to Washington and lobby the federal government to make that happen? That's got all sorts of problems. And I discovered American Prairie at that time. And when I understood a little bit about the model, which was using private philanthropy to buy properties that were for sale, obviously, to put together a landscape as significant as any protected area in the lower 48, certainly, it's just like that had me hook, line, and sinker.
That's cool. So American Prairie, it originally started out as American Prairie Reserve. What was the, what was the big picture, and then why did the name change?
Yeah, so before it was even the American Prairie Reserve, it was the Prairie Foundation. And in 1999, there was an assessment done of global ecosystems by World Wildlife Fund. And their focus in North America turned to the grasslands because they're one of the least represented biomes globally, and certainly North America, and that's easy to understand why they were flat and treeless. They were easy to convert to cropping agriculture. And this part of the state, north central Montana, was identified because of the prevalence of public land. And that was a result of the failure of homesteading during the Great Depression. People left. So the land actually reverted back to the federal government. And because of the land settlement and tenure patterns, you don't have to buy all 3.2 million acres, which is what we're trying to assemble, because the private acres come with preferential access to federal grazing leases. And the 3.2 million acres is based on the 1.1 million acre Charlie Russell National Wildlife Refuge. So we're trying to make that bigger. It's really pretty straightforward, and put together this complex of public and private land, do some biodiversity restoration, open it up to the public, and give people a semblance of what was here 210 years ago when Lewis and Clark came through.
Okay, that's great. Let's talk about biodiversity.
So biodiversity and why that's important in American Prairie. In 1804 and 05, when Lewis and Clark came up the Missouri River, they experienced something, a wildlife spectacle that they saw nowhere else in their travels. And that was these immense herds of bison and elk and pronghorn antelope. And the first grizzly bears they ever encountered were along that Missouri River watershed. And the reason was because all those animals that we now think of as exclusively citizens of the rock and ice, Rocky Mountain wilderness were plains animals, and it's easy to understand why. That's where all the food was. So you had carnivores like wolves and grizzly bears trailing these massive herds, picking off the old and the weak and the carrion that was available to them. There was a lot of protein on the ground for those animals. And it was something that was not replicated anywhere else in North America. And of course, those animals are still out there, with the exception of wolves, but at very, very low numbers. So the opportunity to restore, again, it's a semblance of what once was, doesn't exist in very many places. It exists out here because the prairies are still intact. They haven't been plowed. There's very few people. People have been leaving the region for a very long time. And again, the wildlife is there. So our job, because we don't manage the wildlife, we manage the habitat, is to assemble a habitat base, create the favorable conditions for these animals to come back and not repopulate because they're already there, but to exist in higher numbers.
One of the things that Bill talked to me about was he'd like to see considerably larger numbers of wildlife on the landscape, whether it be elk, bighorn sheep, things like that. Is that plausible? Do you really think that you guys, you just mentioned that there's animals already on the landscape. Do you guys think that you guys can get those populations larger? I mean, do you think that's an objective?
Well, it's not up to us, right? It's up to the people of Montana, because again, the state of Montana manages all that wildlife. And what we try to work on, because it's not a biological function that doesn't limit, that is not the limiting factor for wildlife populations, is social tolerance. So we know that wildlife can cause real economic damage. There's just no question about that. So our focus, and this is where I think my background is helpful, is how can we make wildlife a benefit rather than a cost? And if we can do that, and if we're successful in working with our neighbors to view wildlife and really experience wildlife as an economic benefit, I think we can grow those numbers over time.
That's great answer. So we've got this cattle ranching model, and we've got the American Prairie model. I mean, they're two different business models, two different economic models. There's some conflict there. Talk to me about what is the conflict, and how do you guys see a way forward?
So conflict in rural areas around the globe is not uncommon, particularly over wildlife, and you and your viewers understand this from Africa, right? And the same is true in Montana. The culture that exists in north central Montana is one that's been around for 150 years, is very proud, and it's around raising cattle, livestock. American Prairie has a different idea. As we've just discussed, it's about biodiversity restoration. We have 900 bison running around out there. We don't call them bison boys and bison girls, we call them cowboys and cowgirls. So fundamentally, I think the root causes of conflict are about change, fear of change, people being threatened for their economic livelihood. Those are all very understandable. And the only way around that is to build relationships, and that just takes a lot of time.
Yeah, no, definitely 100% on that. So we're talking about that private land and management goals and stuff. We've talked about biodiversity, but there's particular animals that you talked to me when we had coffee the other day about the fact that, whether it be the swift fox, whether it be prairie dogs, whether it be ferrets, there is some stuff out there that you specifically talked about. Kind of, how does that fit into that equation? I'm going to lead into endangered species. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, so prairie dogs are an interesting critter because they're have this sort of ambiguous status in Montana. You can do almost anything you want to them. And that's one of the animals that we feel like we have control over. And why they're so important is they exist on just a small fraction of their home range. And they are a keystone species in that they're a fundamental food source for almost everything that lives on the prairie. Birds, snakes, black-footed ferret, most endangered mammal in North America that are no longer extant in the wild, have to have prairie dogs in order to survive. So in terms of our biodiversity restoration goals, an animal like that, for example, is really critically important.
Well, that's great. Now, let's talk about endangered species. I know you and I spoke about the fact that, there are wolves now on some of these lands, intermittently. There is grizzly bears. I know the PNs has some. I've interviewed some people around Big Sandy that have had some predation issues and human-wildlife conflict. Talked to a lady in the Bear Paws Mountains that's got a camera behind her house, a trail camera, and she's taking pictures of grizzly bears, like weekly, going through there. This is a place that hasn't seen bears in a long time. Kind of explain to me, how do bears, how do wolves, how do these large apex predators fit into the APR, or American Prairie model, that modeling of conservation and land use?
Yeah, well, philosophically, they're very important. They're all pieces of the ecosystem, and we'd like them all to be there. Grizzly bears, of course, are still managed by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, so they're a federally managed species, and again, we have no control over the wildlife. Wolves are managed by the state, and ultimately, again, it comes down to tolerance on the landscape. And one thing I've noticed is the ranching community is pro-wildlife. They just don't want grizzly bears in children's playgrounds. Yeah, neither do we. Totally get that. And in regard to grizzly bears in particular, there's been a 20-year effort in this state by a whole bunch of other groups. American Prairie hasn't been involved to make that go better and to show people how they can coexist with this magnificent animal It's the state animal. So we'd like it back on the prairies, of course, and again, our job is to create the habitat base, to do the sociological work so that when they do coming back, because as you mentioned, they are, it goes well.
Yeah, that's great. So again, I want to throw some stuff at you here that I hear from other folks out there, and we're gonna let this airplane go by us, but we'll start with the fact that I've heard crazy stories about supposedly the government dropping off wolves and grizzly bears around where your guys' lands are, on public land, that the federal government's doing this, that maybe you guys are doing this, or other parties. I mean, you hear this innuendo and these rumors and stuff. What do you, as far as when it comes to these big apex predators, how would you address something like that?
Oh, well, crazy stories are crazy stories. I mean, you've seen a grizzly bear. You can't just trundle that into the back of your pickup truck and go drop it off somewhere. They're going to have an opinion about being moved around like that. So, I just don't put any credence into that. And again, we have grizzly bears on our properties, and we immediately called Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and they were fantastic because very helpfully, they consider the entire state to be grizzly bear country. And again, people are not only tolerant of wildlife, they like to see it in the appropriate ways, of course. And that's the trick, that's the balancing act. And American Prairie is not doctrinaire or absolute. When we first started, the rap was, you're never going to allow hunting on your properties. You're going to be a bunch of, granola-eating yuppies from Bozeman. And I mean, that's obviously just not the case. Hunting is the wildlife management tool, right? Because in lots of places we don't have enough carnivores, predators to control these animal populations. So,
well, we definitely want to get back into that at great length. But let's stick with the bison and the predators around the landscape there. Is there, I know some of your early on paperwork I saw on your bison manuals and stuff like that talked about having a certain number, anywhere from 10 to 30,000 bison on the landscape, kind of free roaming around, and that population would be, in theory, managed by apex predators. Not man, but that's what I read. Is that evolved? Is that really reality? Or what is the real reality, and how do you see apex predators working in that? Because you're still going to have people out there living on the landscape with cattle.
Yeah, I think the example you have to look to is Yellowstone, where that bison herd is managed by a variety of techniques, which includes a lot of human intervention. And I think that's the reality of the situation. The one thing, though, I do want to correct is this notion of free-roaming bison. So outside of Yellowstone National Park, there are no wild bison. Our bison are domestic livestock. They have to be behind fences. We cannot have them trespassing on our neighbors' properties. Think of them as furry cows. That's exactly how the state treats them. And we still believe we can have a lot of animals on a big landscape under those conditions.
So, back with the state and bison, though, obviously the governor here in Montana is and the attorney general are in litigation right now with the BLM. Are you guys a part of that somehow?
Yeah, we joined as interveners.
Okay, so basically the FWP, which manages the wildlife on the landscape here in Montana, the governor that dictates the policies of FWP is in litigation with you guys. Tell me what's going on and why is it going on?
Yeah, so the litigation is against the Bureau of Land Management, and it's challenging the Bureau of Land Management's authority to allow bison grazing on federal grazing allotments under the Taylor Grazing Act. So that's an issue that we leave to the BLM to defend. We're involved because we're involved, and we want to be close to the proceedings.
That's great. So what would be the outcome of this if it goes one way or the other? How would that affect your operations if they?
Well, if the decision went against us at the end of litigation, so that would be the Supreme Court or the appellate court, then we would only be able to have bison on our deeded acres, the acres that we own privately. If it goes for us, which I expect it will, because bison have been grazing on the federal public lands for 40 years in this country, then we'll continue when the time is right on the appropriate properties to ask the BLM to authorize bison grazing.
Okay, that's good. Let's talk about hunting. I was out driving around with Beth and your marketing guy, again, his name's breaking my mind here. So, but I mean, it's very remote country. Access is not easy. There's a few roads out there. What roads are not even improved gravel roads for the most part. And anyone who's spent any time in the breaks of Montana and that part of the world knows that if it gets wet, you ain't traveling around. You might get stuck for a week someplace until you can get the roads to the point where they're passable. Your big picture is about getting people out on the land and seeing things. Who's actually using these lands and why are they using them at this point in time? And what do you think the future holds?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. The data that we have on our visitation, so we have campgrounds and huts, so we actually record people who come, is it's predominantly Montanans who are coming to visit. And I think this is largely driven during COVID and also by the crowding in the western part of the state. So it's Montanans rediscovering the prairie, looking for a little solitude, looking for maybe the way it was in the western part of the state 25 years ago, coming out and enjoying the public access that we provide. And of course, American Prairie is going against the tide of less public access in the state of Montana by opening up almost all of our lands to recreationists of all stripes.
But what I'm seeing is the people using us are hunters for the most part. I mean, as far as being actually physically out on the land are hunters on that. Do you guys have a program or are you trying to basically educate hunters more about what's going on? It seems like a low-hanging fruit for you guys as far as having a group out there that would be more akin to your mission. Is there thought about that at all?
Yeah, I mean, when you go during hunting season, you see hunters, but we have, birders. It's a huge birding area going out there. But hunters are the main recreationists, I would say. And to the extent they want to learn about our project and support it for the public lands and the quality hunting on our private lands, we welcome that kind of support. That's a constituency where 5 years ago we were sort of persona non grata, and we've made great progress because their concern, like a lot of Montana's concern, was this was a bait and switch. We were going to close these public land or close our private lands and landlock the public lands sometime to have a big playground for the wealthy. And we've had to earn their support over the last 5 years, and it's just doing what we say we're going to be doing.
So is the land going to be open for access for hunting in perpetuity, or how is that going to work? Because you guys you're a private entity. Mm-hmm. You're run by a board, and the board may this year have an opinion. It may change down the road, 5, 10, 100 years from now. Really, how are you guys addressing that? Yeah. How can you convince the hunters and the sportsmen, those outdoor recreationalists, that this land truly is going to be available to them?
Really good question. People need to understand the ultimate land acquisition model, which will be 20% private and 80% public. So our land, we own round numbers, 140,000 acres. We lease 375,000 acres. The 375,000 acres are public lands over which we have no control to exclude people. So that land is in the public domain, will remain in the public domain. The private lands that we have are open to the public for all sorts of recreation, will be open to the public. Will it be open in perpetuity, every single acre? The only honest answer to that is, I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. One of the things we were talking about is endangered species, and I know the sage grouse is something that's being considered to be potentially put on a threatened list. And I've talked to biologists and people that even live out in this country, in this area that you guys are at, that are biologists, and they tell me that there's plenty of habitat for sage grouse. But one of the issues for sage grouse is disease, avian diseases, which are huge, and then of course predation. Now, as you mentioned earlier, there's less and less people out in that country. I mean, ever since the Great Depression, people have been moving out of this world. That's why BLM has all that land. And of course, the folks that were there homesteading, I mean, they hammered this place, right? They hammered the lands. They were really rough on them. And it's taken probably up to now, in many cases, for a lot of these lands to come back, to have some vibrancy, to have some fertility to them. I know one of your policies that you guys don't do any predator management. You say hunting of coyotes or anything like that on your lands. how does that square up with the viability of, say, sage grouse? Because what I'm hearing is that some of these folks, including a rancher that is a retired biologist, talk specifically about the fact that every coyote that they end up harvesting or shooting, they check the contents of the stomach, and they've got sage grouse feathers on them.
Yeah.
And so we went from this period where there was a ton of human involvement and they hammered everything, including the predators, because they were competing against them, to now we've moved away from trapping here as a society. We have a lot more predators on the landscape, but we also have this endangered species, potential endangered species of the sage grouse. Would there ever be an opportunity to manage the whole host of animals on the land, including predators?
Oh, I think yes. There's always that potential. Again, we're not doctrinaire. We're not closed off to any kind of conversation. Sage grouse habitat, is my understanding, is the limiting factor to those population. Climate change, as you mentioned, avian flu. Certainly, there's predation. There's no question about that. We sit on some of the best sage grouse habitat in the state of Montana, and we're committed to conserving that, and also committed to working with the state to make sure they don't get listed, because we don't want our management affected as much as anyone else does. So
yeah, let's let this plane go by real quick. Whatever, I think it just landed. One of the things I was real interested in having you talk about too is this managing the land, not the wildlife.
The wildlife in the United States is managed by state wildlife management agencies, so we cannot do anything to affect that. So managing the land first is buying the habitat, making sure that it's conserved, so the native prairie grassland is conserved, in some cases restored. So the riparian areas in this part of the state are incredibly important. Sometimes they've been degraded by cattle grazing, so restoring those riparian areas is incredibly important. Restoring plowed native prairie to its native state is another thing that's very important to us. And again, just putting that habitat together, making sure it's in the best quality that it can be to aid in wildlife restoration, if you will, or more wildlife abundance, I think is probably the precise term.
That's great. So back on the bison now, we talked a lot of time about the fact that bison are livestock, and if they go to become designated wildlife, then FWP now manages the bison herds. You really don't have a lot of bison on the landscape. You got about 900 split between two properties. And I noticed that the management style on two properties are different. One is there's a lot of cross fencing, and the bison are moved around so that they're forced to eat in certain parts, whereas the other property is basically just one continuous fence around the outside. And what Scott talked to me about and Garrett was this pretty heavy reliance on doing studies and having transects on the second property that's open to be able to see what the impacts are. Because I've had people talk to me about the issue of overgrazing, soil degradation, because of the ability of bison to be around there. And originally, some of the terminology that came out of the concept between this organization was to have a large free roaming herd on 3 million acres or 4 million acres, whatever it is. How do you guys, I mean, really, from your point of view and your position in the organization, really, how are you guys going to grow the herd, and how are you going to manage it?
Yeah, so under their current status as livestock, again, they cannot trespass. So our goal is to put together large acreages and have those animals operate across those acreages as naturally as possible, so we're not running them through a pasture rotation system. So if you take a look at some of our properties, they're pretty darn big and capable of supporting on single properties a couple thousand animals. So when the time is right, and by that I mean when we're ready as an organization, because it's a big undertaking to put bison on a property, that's the plan. And 20 years from now, if bison are still considered livestock, you could have as many bison on the prairie landscape on our private and leased properties as you do in Yellowstone behind a perimeter fence. So this notion of a free roaming bison herd in central Montana right now is just a dead letter.
So could you compare, like, the Flying D? Turner's got 4,500 bison on that, and it's not anywhere near the size of your place. Give some people some idea of the comparisons here.
Yeah, so totally different ecosystem. We're up in north central Montana where you get less than 11 inches of precip. Ted Turner's in one of the greenest places in the Gallatin Valley. So you can run a lot more animals because there's a lot more moisture and hence a lot more grass. And he has a very different management objective. His management objective is to maximize the offtake from his ranch, right, to support his restaurants, etc. Ours is not. Ours is to have a herd that is having an ecological impact on the landscape. And because of the social political realities, we have way fewer animals per acre than we could have just because of the environment in which we're working.
But I guess also I'd like you to maybe touch on the fact that there seems to be this concern over tens of thousands of bison roaming there, but the reality is even here in Montana, we already have bison herds on private land that are substantially more than what you guys have. Maybe if you could address that.
So I think one of the challenges around bison in Montana regarding American Prairie is people have become used to them around Yellowstone National Park. And that's where most of the bison are in those counties, including Ted Turner's ranch is probably 60 miles from the entrance to Yellowstone. So we've got bison back on the prairie for the first time in 150 years. That is a big change. And people look at what's going on in Yellowstone and they're not happy about that bison management from a variety of different perspectives. And they don't want a repeat of that in central Montana. Neither do we.
And hence that's why you guys are doing the bison roundups with all the study
Disease
and
testing.
disease testing and all that stuff. Yeah, we saw that firsthand, and it's obviously pretty extensive. Maybe touch on that. Why are you doing the disease testing? And I've got the guys talking about particulars, right?
Yeah.
The different diseases, but as an organizational standpoint, why do you do the testing?
We do extensive disease testing because it's the right thing to do as a livestock operator.
So long-term strategic plan, American Prairie. What is the overall, at this point in time, what is that strategic plan long-term? And how much has it evolved since 22 years ago when this thing started?
The biggest difference from when I started is that it's taken longer to buy the land than we thought. And that's not great because land gets more expensive over time. So the long-term goal remains the same. Get together somewhere around 2 million acres that surrounds the Charlie Russell, which is 1 million acres, to have this 3 million acre complex of land. Highly unlikely it will be a contiguous landscape. So it'll be fractured and broken. And what I think you'll see in 20 years is areas where you have really, really big bison pastures and some thousands of animals on that landscape. They will be surrounded by thousands of cattle, a lot on American Prairie properties, because not every one of our properties is going to be appropriate for bison. Hopefully we'll see a lot more wildlife on that landscape, and certainly we will see a lot more of the public enjoying all sorts of recreational opportunities.
Okay, that's great. Let's talk about some of the detractors. So you and I talked about this last time. We talked about United Properties of Montana, Save the Cowboy. They obviously have an opinion here, and we're giving them an opportunity to tell us what their opinion is. But what would you want to say to them?
Yeah, I would say you don't have to love us. You just have to respect our property rights. You know, we're putting our money where our mouths are, and we're buying this land, and we're working within all the rules and regulations to achieve our vision. And that's a hell of a lot better than the federal government coming in and doing it to you.
Funding. Where does the money come for American Prairie?
So American Prairie's funding comes from individual donors predominantly all over the United States. Some foundations, almost zero corporate money. A lot of Montanans support us at all different sorts of levels.
And so, but I hear people talk about foreigners, the Save the Serengeti, American Serengeti, the German guys that are involved in the grocery store chains, and hear about that it's the Mars family. It's just 10 or 12 really big donors that are, how much money is coming from these really big donors?
Most of the money is coming from extremely successful and wealthy American philanthropists who care about America.
Okay, great. And also talk about, that's about land prices. I've had some people tell me that because I know you guys are buying the land free, and people are selling things without being coerced or anything like that. and you guys have to pay a fair value based on real estate values. I mean, you legally have to do that. But I do have people telling me that some of the prices of land in this area has gone up. I'm gonna let this guy go by because he was flying over the top of us. But land prices have definitely risen, and they're rising all over the West too, right? But I've got some bankers that have even told me, hey, specifically in this area where you guys are, south of Malta, that some of these values are going up for two reasons. One is you guys are on the, you got players on the field, and the other one is the trophy ranch, which you and I talked a little about this last time, but they're putting a lot of pressure on here, to buy land to be a playground. And they're competing with you, I would assume, for land purchases. But what do you say to the people that say that, hey, you guys are upping the price and you're making it impossible for anybody to be able to be a rancher?
Well, first of all, I'd say it's very expensive to get into the ranching game, no matter who you are. And we follow land prices very carefully, and they appreciate considerably over time in the mid to high single digits. It's really quite remarkable. American Prairie is one of several active land buyers in north central Montana, which is a good thing for the sellers because they've got more opportunity and more choice. We track these numbers very carefully. Some of the fastest appreciation are in counties that we're not even operating in. So to say that American Prairie is the variable that's driving up these land costs, I think, is an incomplete answer.
No, that's great. One of the other things I heard was someone mentioned, I think you and I talked about this too, was that bison destroy the land through overgrazing, whatever else. What is your comment to that? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, grassland ecosystems can be overgrazed by any species. Certainly across the American West, we see the damage done by cattle grazing. Bison are no exception. If they're poorly managed, they can impact the ecosystem. What I would tell people about our bison grazing is, you got to come out and see it. At the end of the day, it's an empirical question. Is the resource better or worse after bison or cattle have grazed on it? And if our bison are causing damage, we will fix it. And if you ask the Bureau of Land Management, it has to come out and inspect the federal allotments on which we graze bison. They've improved over time.
So let's also address this comment I hear that, basically the communities are being shredded because when you guys buy up a ranch, there's not a family coming back in. There's not kids going to school. There's nobody buying implements from the implement dealer in Lewistown. Is that real? I mean, are you guys truly, is this, like I said, I'm looking for, you talked to me before, so, well, you get your own employees that are here, but it's not necessarily replacing one for one. Talk to me about it.
Yeah, I think that's a false dichotomy. We never say that American Prairie is a replacement for the traditional agricultural economy. You've got to think about it. Is it additive or is it subtractive? And we have 10 employees in Lewistown. We have 15 employees up on these properties. We're bringing people into the communities. We have families who shop in local grocery stores, attend church, coach their kids' sports teams, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If American Prairie is the cause of the death of rural Montana, they're dead.
So is American Prairie part of the community in that part of the world? And if it is, why is it?
Yeah, I think it's a part of the community, and we're getting better at this all the time because we actually have people living in the communities. And again, community implies concerted efforts at trust building and relationship building. And it takes a very, very long time, and it can't be shortcut. But American Prairie is committed to being good members of the communities in which we work.
We talked about taxes the other day. Explain to me, some people say American Prairie doesn't pay taxes, they're nonprofit. So explain to me what you guys actually do. Give me some idea. Just kind of give us some idea of what it costs.
So as a nonprofit, American Prairie is a tax, as I tell our staff, a tax-exempt for-profit business entity.
So we're talking about taxes here, and I'm being told that American Prairie doesn't pay taxes.
So American Prairie is a tax-exempt organization, and we don't pay property taxes, or we don't pay property taxes on 160 acres. We're exempt from that. On every other acre, we pay property taxes. So on every property that we own, we pay taxes. On every piece of machinery that we own, we pay business equipment taxes. We are exempt from taxes on income that we earn. which is probably over the course of a year between $500,000 and $750,000. And that's a function of the federal tax code that we're not responsible for. So yeah, that's the situation around taxes.
I know your original plan was to buy all this land that's north of the Charlie Russell National Wildlife Refuge, south of Malta. But in the last handful of years, you guys have started to pick up ranches south of the Missouri River, PN being a big purchase there. We've purchased other ranches south of the river there. Why, if you're trying to create this contiguous, or as much of contiguous land mass there tied around that refuge on the north side, because that's what people seem to think that's the places we're going, and that's what your maps show too. Why were you buying our properties to the south of the river?
Yeah, it's always been our plan to buy north and south of the river, and those opportunities just came up when they did. And again, the idea is that Charlie Russell is a linear refuge, east to west, not north to south. So try to create a buffer around that to preclude the problems of wildlife spilling out of a national wildlife refuge like they do out of Yellowstone every spring, by having a landowner that's very tolerant of wildlife on their land.
And when we talked over coffee, you mentioned something about wildlife corridors.
Yeah, so wildlife corridors are extremely important between any protected area landscape for reasons of genetics and genetic diversity. And we hope that not that American Prairie will be buying land in these wildlife corridors, but we have ranches that are favorable to wildlife sort of in a triangle between Glacier National Park and Yellowstone. And we already see wildlife starting to come from those two places, those reservoirs. And our job at American Prairie is to make sure that when they get to American Prairie, they have enough habitat and food and space to avoid conflict with people, and that they can, start to come back in more abundance, I would guess.
That's great. So do you guys, when you're purchasing these lands, do you ever use third-party companies or shell companies or anything like that to purchase land?
I think we've done 48 transactions, and we've used a third party once at the request of the seller, and that was all about that seller, which is totally understandable, feeling uncomfortable socially, having people know that he sold to American Prairie. But everybody knows that we're in the land acquisition business. We're very transparent about that. So it's not our practice to have a stealth or a shell company that's out purchasing.
So is there I guess associated with a Mid-Mountain Cattle Company or Mid-Mountain LLC by any means?
Yeah, I don't know what the name of it was. Garrett will know. If you
I
ask
had
him.
a rancher tell me that one of his ranches was purchased by you guys through this Mid-Mountain LLC, I think he said, which he'd already turned down an offer from you guys, and this other entity came in, and it turned out that I don't know whether they sold to you immediately or what happened, but it ended up that ranch ended up in your guys'.
Yeah, Garrett knew, and that seller knew what was going on. Yeah. He wasn't born at night or last night.
Great. So if there was really something you want the broader public, our urban our target audience, the people who are really trying to reach here, that urban population throughout the Western world, especially here in the United States, what message would that be from American Prairie? What would you want them to know and understand about what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I think that the opportunity for people to experience an ecosystem that was such an integral part of our nation's heritage and founding, I mean, the westward expansion from the East Coast to the West Coast is really quite a remarkable thing. And we're just trying to create a very small, geographically speaking, in the context of the West, a very small area where people can experience something of what it looked like before it was really lost to development.
So you think Montanans should be proud of what you guys are doing? And if so, why and how can they be involved?
Because Montanans should be proud of what we're doing, because Montana is a conservation leader. And we care deeply about wildlife and open lands and public lands and places, and this is going to be another book in that library shelf, if you will, of places that this state can be really proud of. In 25 years, I think people will look back and say, boy, it's really cool that we've got something like American Prairie on this landscape.
That's great. Is there anything you want to add?
Nope.
anything that I've missed?
No, I mean, do you have any more questions? You know,
I don't. Yeah. Like I said, I don't. You and I talked for an hour and a half the other day, and we covered a lot of stuff. But again, like I said, I'm just telling you what I've heard. This is what I understand.
Yeah.
This is what I've seen firsthand. One thing we didn't talk about, and you talked about the fact, I asked you about this last time, was that there is this rumor out there that you guys are, you're buying up these lands and you're dismantling all the improvements, so the tanks, water and stuff, which obviously you and I talked about this, but why don't you just address that? So is American Prairie, when you buy a property, are you taking out all the man-made improvements that also help and benefit the wildlife?
Yeah, so typically when American Prairie buys a property, what's typically going to happen is going to be leased back to the seller as a cattle operation. So all that infrastructure, whether it's stock ponds or fencing, either get improved or certainly maintained until such time we figure out we're going to do something differently to it. And the reality in this part of Montana is that water is a really scarce resource, and the ponds that have been created over 100 years are critical to wildlife. And so we have no plans to remove that stuff, anytime soon.
Yeah, like I said, I hear all these things and everybody talks to me and it's like, hey, wait a minute. This doesn't quite jive anything. No, and I think you and I've got pretty well what we're doing. And I'm really fascinated, looking forward to getting to Bill and just kind of hearing his big picture stuff. And I think he's just, like I said, it was one of the most fascinating conversations.
Yeah, that's great. I'm really glad that went the way it did. And, when you're talking to people and you're hearing these rumors, you could just say, well, I've been out there and I've seen it, and I talked to a lot of people, and I really don't think you've got it quite right.
So I'm a journalist. So I have my own personal opinions.
Yeah.
When I make these films, damn it, they're going to be right down the middle as best we can, because otherwise I'm just creating propaganda for something, which I don't want to do. But what I have found, Pete, with these films is that I'm seeing a lot of disparate sides who really aren't that far apart at the end of the day. Stop and go, wow, I didn't quite realize it. Because even when we're sitting across the table there having a meeting, we know somebody's not happy that this is going on. Or, I've heard this, when you guys first got on the ground, ranchers are like, what am I supposed to do when a whole bunch of black Suburbans pull roaring up into my driveway and they're wearing suits and they're telling me they're going to save the prairie? I mean, to a fiercely independent Montana rancher, no matter if they're doing the best thing in the world for the land, that's going to throw a red flag.
Sure.
And so it just seems to me like, from what I've been able to ascertain, is that it kind of started out on the wrong foot.
Yeah, I think we own a lot of that. We got to own it. Some of this language about saving stuff has not been particularly helpful. But you live and learn and move on.
Well, that's the one thing. I think most Montanans are pretty open to a lot of stuff, and they're willing to sit down and say, hey, I get it. This save the cowboy thing, you and I really didn't talk much about it. You had a pretty short sentence there about what you thought, but I mean it's an effort to create what I call a reverse conservation easement. Sans bison, I guess, is what they don't call it a bison easement, but the reality is it's 20 years. What does that mean? I mean, it doesn't really mean anything in the big picture of all this.
No.
But I get it that it's change, right? Humans are averse to change in life. We get set in our ways. We don't really want to see a lot of change, especially if life is going ahead okay. But you show me one rancher that doesn't. They're fighting every day for their lifestyle, whether it be worried about wildfire or disease in their cattle or wildlife, human-wildlife conflict,
trade policies, meat packers.
Yeah, it's a tough world for them. And so how could American Prairie be a better friend or a better component of this big picture when it comes to cattle ranching here in Montana?
Yeah, well, we have this program, Wild Sky, which is an incentive-based program for ranchers. We pay them for wildlife, so that's one thing. It's again back to when there are incentives or economic benefits to things, you tend to get more of them, right? And wildlife is the same way. So there's that. I think that, Tom, quite frankly, it's just going to take more time. When you go talk to Dale Veseth, he doesn't really like what we're doing. He likes our people. And he didn't like the Matador Ranch 25 years ago when that came along, And it's on us to walk the walk and do right by people. And I don't have an easy answer for that because it just takes a long time.
It's always kind of, we had all these people that come to the parks here, all these tourists. Of course, we talk about we don't have a sales tax except for in resorts. And we talk about, hey, we got to get some money out of these people. And of course, we're all got our hands out renting off our Turo vehicles and renting our houses out and, doing all this stuff, Airbnb, trying to get some of that money from these people coming out of here. It seems to me as a Montanan myself and been here for 26, 27 years, that here's a great opportunity. You guys are bringing a bunch of money that would never be here otherwise, like the film industry. I worked real hard to get incentives here in the state back in 04, 05.
Yeah.
And the reality is it doesn't have much of a footprint, right? And you get this money come out here, and you don't have to pay back a rebate for bringing it in unless they bring the money in. And it seems like you guys are kind of not exactly the same, but you're bringing in tens of millions of dollars every year, and a lot of that's getting spent here because when that money is paid to the rancher for the land, that rancher has that money. That's real money. What is the rancher doing with that money? And of course, you've already told me that some of these people can actually stay on the land. Mm-hmm. Maybe you talk to me a little bit about, when I know they're going to lease it back to them, but I know that you'd mentioned something in our earlier conversation was that sometimes you guys have arrangements for these people to stay on these lands for a considerable amount of time. But how does that work?
Yeah, so let's maybe frame it a little bigger than that, in that no conservation project can be successful without the people affected benefiting economically. How about that? Just for a starter.
That's the whole premise of my movies.
Yeah. But I mean, that's a real fundamental thing. We were just talking about this today. So we had a group down in Argentina, and what they've been able to do down there, a bigger conservation project than ours, is they've been able to get the local communities to not only embrace it, but to benefit economically from their conservation work. So that's fundamental. We want to do that. We're not there yet by any stretch of the imagination. But when a rancher sells to us and they get money for that ranch, the most typical outcome is, because they're older and they don't have children who are coming back to the ranch. That's not the case with every rancher. But in those cases where that is true, what they're looking to do is to have a more simplified, more manageable lifestyle. So they leave Southern Phillips County and they generally go to Malta or Glasgow or Chinook. And they stay in agriculture, but they just do it at a scale that they can actually manage at that stage in life. Very few are jetting off to Scottsdale or Maui or any place like that and totally leaving the neighborhood. It's their community. Why would they leave?
And the money they get from you, they spend on their community.
Yeah.
So you could say most of these dollars get spent right here in Montana.
I think so. I mean, obviously I don't know the particulars, but that's my assumption. And the fact that most people stay. I think only one couple is left, and this was back before I started. They were so fed up with the federal government, they went to Nebraska and bought, a totally private property operation. But that's the only couple that I've heard that is left. Everybody else is still around.
Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.